Are you ready to perform at your highest potential? Welcome to the Performance Matters podcast from GP Strategies, your talent transformation partner. In each episode, we'll interview industry experts and explore best practices and innovative insights to help your organization improve performance.
So I suppose just for the sake of positioning what we're talking about, it would be great to know what we mean by compliance. How do we? How do we start that one off, Liz?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great place to start, actually, because it's a deceptively simple question, and we use the word compliance and the phrase compliance training all the time, but we don't necessarily all use it in the same way or mean the same thing. And I suspect that the answer to that question probably depends on who you ask, interestingly. So it would be good to come up with a sort of agreed meaning of the phrase for the purposes of this conversation. I think if you were to ask someone in financial services, the answer would be relatively clear. They have, after all, compliance departments and compliance officers. So their compliance training means mandatory training, usually that's delivered or definitely delivered to meet a legal or regulatory obligation. So it would cover things like financial crime, conflicts of interest, information security, etc. But it probably goes wider than that because compliance is definitely growing. And I think that's probably one of the things that's interesting from this conversation. So it's now including things like diversity and equality, ESG, whistleblowing. These are increasingly becoming included in the remit of compliance departments. And that's driven, I think, by the fact that financial services regulators have also shown an interest in these topics. So as soon as the regulators show an interest, then it becomes something that the compliance departments are interested in, and that triggers the compliance training. And I think that makes labeling and terminology even trickier. It's not just financial services, though, that's heavily regulated. We've also got sectors like healthcare, pharmaceuticals, who obviously have their own specific compliance and legal obligations. And even in unregulated sectors or relatively unregulated sectors, compliance training is also often used as the phrase to refer to mandatory training that meets regulatory and legal obligations. So bribery and corruption, data protection, cybersecurity, they're all increasingly referred to, I think, by a wide range of organizations as compliance training. So if I were pushed to come up with a definition, which it isn't easy to do for today's purposes, I'd probably say that compliance training is training that an organization classes as mandatory and that's delivered either in response to a regulatory or legal obligation or as part of a mandatory onboarding program for employees. Not a perfect definition, but it's probably the best I could do for today's purposes.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, I wonder if there are any sort of areas. You said that compliance is sort of growing, and certainly diversity, inclusion, and ESG are examples of where I've seen new areas sort of coming into our compliance team. But is there anything you'd say was not? Does it it has to be, in your mind, mandatory and linked to a regulatory need? And so anything outside of this area?
Yeah, it's something that we've spoken about before, isn't it? That as compliance gets wider and wider and wider, it's more and more difficult to think of things that don't fall within the definition. Because in theory, compliance and ESG more or less covers everything within organizational training. But I would probably say sales training, something like that, or soft skills training wouldn't be included in compliance training. And I think if it's not mandatory, we'd have to look at that definition quite closely. So I think that mandatory aspect is really important.
I was going to suggest sort of areas of process and operations, but of course, things like operational risk and how organizations deal with that are all totally part of this.
The Performance Matters podcast is brought to you by GP Strategies. Together, we can create a world where business excellence makes possibilities achievable. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get podcasts or listen on our website at gpstrategies.com.